Hello, today is Thursday, April 22nd, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. If you're a longtime listener to Staying Connected, you know that we cover an array of ICT topics, new technologies, changes in the supplier landscape, legal and regulatory issues, and generally everything that's part of the ICT lifecycle. Sometimes, though, it's important for us to cover the basics of telecom procurement and contracting to help someone who's new to the category or as a refresher for a telecom veteran. That's one reason why we recently ran a 3-part class covering the basics of telecom procurement and contracting. On today's podcast, I'm joined by the architects of that class, Laura McDonald, a partner at LB3, and my fellow TC2 Director, Pat Gilpatrick. Laura and Pat are going to give a quick overview of the class and highlight some interesting observations. Hey, Pat, that was quite a class that you and Laura were able to pull together.
Yes, thanks, Joe. We felt the time was right, and frankly, we were really impressed by the number of attendees and their level of interest in the topics.
So, what did you cover?
Well, our mission was to get back to the basics of telecom procurement and contracting. The three of us have been in this industry for a long time, but there are a lot of new IT professionals that were clamoring for a class like this, and we also had some longtime clients that wanted the sessions. On day one, we covered procurement basics. The major components were telecom procurement planning or strategy, execution, and management.
You know, a lot goes into that first bit, that planning. Isn't that right, Laura?
Joe, hi. You're absolutely right. Planning is essential to an effective procurement. And there are specific strategy components of the planning, and Pat and I laid these out. And those strategy components include knowing what technology you want to buy and how you're going to buy it, understanding your leverage versus the supplier's leverage, and then having a plan to maximize your leverage, both during the negotiations and over time. In addition to have an effective procurement, you have to define your objectives and your scope. You have to understand and define them. You have to understand your existing commitments and what you're willing to commit to going forward. And you must understand that in planning a procurement, in order to maximize your return on investment, timing is everything. These are all topics we address in greater detail in the seminar.
Yep, and after that, we looked at execution, which includes planning for an RFP, evaluating the proposals you get back from the suppliers, and then negotiating. I think one of the aha moments was when we emphasized that after a contract is signed, it's really just the beginning, and explained how you need to manage the relationship over the entire life cycle to get the most out of what you've worked so hard to negotiate or achieve. We talked about non-competitive procurement strategies as well, like negotiating with incumbents for term renewals or in-term rate reviews.
All right, thanks for that, Pat. So, Laura, day 2 covered, I think, contract basics. So I guess as the lawyer here, you must have loved that session.
Oh, I live for contracts. You know I did. As you know, telecom contracts are legally complex, and that's due in part to the regulatory overlay and the breadth of services that are involved. And it's important to know what regulations apply, what they apply to, and how that impacts your contracts, as well as your provider's position on issues. Just as an example, regulation impacts things like how long you have to bring a claim if you have a dispute and where you can bring it. It's what is subject to the Universal Service Fund surcharge. And also it helps you understand how all these other surcharges arose and the impact that they have on the bottom line of your invoice in which you pay. In addition to the regulatory overlay, to address the breadth of services and documents, a good chunk of our session covered contract structure. And then, of course, negotiations, as Pat mentioned. You know, I can't have a discussion about the basics of contracting for telecom without spending some time on the order of precedence. That is how the pieces all go together. And of course, those pesky online terms, which tend to trip folks up.
Yep, we also touched on key terms like commitments, pricing, and billing terms, and the most important legal terms like remedies, limits of liability, confidentiality. We wrapped up the session by actually demonstrating how to navigate around in the supplier's online service guides, which do contain terms and conditions for services. But according to Laura, according to our best-in-class practice, they should always be last in the order of precedence.
Well, that tour alone would have been worth the price of admission. So, okay, what did you cover on day 3, the last session?
Well, the first two sessions were a lot of fun, and day 3 was really fun because we tried to cover telecom technology and service level agreements in 30 to 40 minutes.
Oh, yeah. So what were some of the technologies that you touched on?
Well, we could have talked all day on any of them. Frankly, we could have talked all day with each session's topics. But we talked about a high level data networking, voice services, local access services, cloud service, managed service, and wireless. And we could just touch the surface on these because, first of all, there were a lot of technologies available. We addressed them all. And secondly, the topics can get really technical really fast.
Folks, they probably have heard about the technologies you talked about, but maybe in terms that were too technical to fully understand what the technologies actually are, or geez, how to buy them for that matter. Now, I don't want to get all acronymy on you guys, but I'm sure that you covered DIA and MPLS connecting to SD-WAN to reach the ISP.
That's right, we did. Pat and I have been there, and we wanted to help folks understand the technologies better, particularly because so many enterprises are in the midst of migrating or planning for migration from legacy services, either as part of their own initiative or based on pressure from the providers who want to stop providing legacy services. So if you're new to this area, you hear those acronyms like you just rattled through, but you may not understand what your company traditionally purchased and what they're migrating to right now. What are the components of those pieces and how that impacts your underlying contracts and procurements. So that's why we went through actual diagrams, and Pat did a fantastic job of this, showing the newer technologies and the components of those technologies that the enterprises purchase. So basic PSTN, an acronym for Public Switched Telephone Network Services, are being and have been replaced by VoIP services using SIP trunking and things like MS Teams. So we went through that. And of course, most companies are migrating some portion of their infrastructure to a cloud environment, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. So we talked about cloud, as Pat mentioned. Managed services and wireless services are so important to the new mobile workforce, which has only increased with the pandemic. So we touched on that as well. And to your point regarding SD-WAN, you can't talk about procuring telecom today without talking about the importance of technologies like software-defined networking and internet first, because it's becoming critical for many enterprises. So we covered a lot in a short period of time.
And then the last topic that you covered were service level agreements, or SLAs.
That's absolutely right. So we looked at the 4 distinct parts of SLAs, both from a practical and a contracting perspective. So those are how suppliers' performance is measured and validated. What are the minimum requirements for performance? What are the conditions and exceptions? Because there are always those. And then finally, what's the remedy when a carrier fails to meet one of the SLAs?
Yes, and SLAs are always an interesting topic with our clients because many folks just assume that SLAs are standard and they aren't something you can actually customize or negotiate. But when we explain that SLAs can be negotiated to cover installation, ongoing performance, or other operational elements, there was a high level of interest.
I have to say that you two covered a ton of content in that class. And what's so impressive is that it was all important.
It was. And while we still had a lot of attendees, not everyone was able to make all 3 sessions or maybe just 1 or 2 of the sessions. So we're happy to share our slides to an enterprise user upon request. That includes the acronym glossary we added, which was in response to a particular participant's request.
And Pat or I or any of the LB3 TC2 team would be happy to discuss any of the topics that we covered. Just shoot us a request, because sometimes it's helpful to have the slides and some words, although that may just be my lawyer bias.
All right. Thank you, Laura. And thank you as well, Pat. Now, I know the sessions were really well attended and the feedback has been great. And I am also certain that there are people wishing they could have attended. So those are nice options, Pat, that you laid out there if they couldn't attend. Plus, not to worry, we are going to be running more training and conferences throughout the year. Now, if you do want to learn more about Pat and Laura's recent class, or you just have other ICT needs, please do contact Pat, Laura, me, or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2, and we will sort you out. You can also stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.